Hello, today's video is called Today is Not Popular in Alberta. Today was day 19 of the public inquiry to the federal government for invoking the Emergency Act on February 2022. Today is November 8, 2022. The agenda for today is overview, today's witnesses, and my point of view. As everybody knows, we're doing a daily summary of the testimonies in this inquiry that seeks to understand if Justin Castro had valid reasons to invoke the Emergency Act on February 14, 2022, and if the powers used by the federal government exceeded the scope granted by the Act. Based on the findings, the lead commissioner will put forward a recommendation in both English and French by February 2023, and this is not a trial. All my videos can be found on YouTube, Lisa Proust Research, as well as my own website, lisaproustresearch.com. If you want to follow the inquiry live, here is the link, and also all previous sessions can be seen and found there. Today we had 3 witnesses between 9:30 a.m. and 6 p.m. The first one was Dana Early, and she is the OPP Superintendent Strategic Commander for the West Region. In this direct examination from the Commission Councillor, I understand the objective to be gathering intelligence for the government. I don't think anymore that this is about finding the truth of what happened and trying to understand if there were enough reasons to invoke the Act, because clearly we can see day after day there weren't any reasons. So even though we hear from the police intelligence that this was supposed to be a temporary protest, we consistently find, not only through the Hendon report, but also through multiple papers, emails, conversations, texts, etc., that it was understood that these protests were supposed to stay until the mandates were lifted. Below we see a report from open source information that is no more complicated than social media being provided to the government. In the cross-examination that started with the government of Canada, the objective is to build a false narrative that the Act was required. So even though one of the requirements to invoke the Act is the intent to overthrow the government, we heard again the following statements from the strategic commander at Windsor. Nobody was really being identified as a leader, and protesters were disjointed and disorganized. So we heard this also from the Ottawa intelligence, and now we're hearing it again from Windsor. So what does this mean about the absence of a leader? Well, it's telling us 3 things at the very least. Number 1, these protests were not a coordinated effort. There were multiple individuals that were protesting against the mandates. So obviously, the narrative of a plot or a terrorist act or any intent to remove the Canadian government is false, because in order for that to be true, you would have to have a coordinated effort. You would have a leader, and that is not the case. This was clearly individuals who were protesting against the mandates after 2 years of being subject to lockdowns and a lot of different impositions. And in the particular case of the truckers, who were heroes for at least 2 years, then all of a sudden they were subject to invasion of their bodily autonomy. Then we had more questions from the councillor from the government of Canada, and this is not a trial, this is an inquiry. However, in a typical trial, there is something called leading the witness, which is always stopped either by the councillor that is defending the parties, or alternatively by the judge ultimately itself. So here is an example of leading the witness, and there are questions that can be answered only by yes or no. The open-ended questions are the real way to do an inquiry. So here you can see some examples, and obviously you can stop the screen and read them, but the bottom line is that even in this question, you can see the counselor smiling and saying yes, because they know where this is going. When it was the turn for the Democracy Fund counselor, I wrote the objective to be to show that the protest was lawful and not violent. So this is an example of the question that illustrates this objective. The question was, there were 88 charges, 44 were only mischiefs, and all of them were non-violent. And then the answer was, yes, but they have the potential to be violent. So again, you can see how you're making assumptions and potentially decisions based on potentials, not on actuals, which obviously that's not legal. On the cross-examination from Slowly counselor, the objective that I see is to prove that the act was required. So in this section, the questions were also leading, requiring yes or no or true. And you can see the examples here. And one of the leading questions was the last one in red. The Emergency Act allowed you to stop them, and of course them, the protesters, from engaging in future protests. And she answered correct. So I will repeat that because it's important to understand what the objective of invoking the act is: to stop anyone from protesting. That is a pretty dangerous statement, and that's why I am repeating it. Then he continued, and during the cross-examination, I felt that the inquiry is almost a joke for these counselors. So Slowly counselor said, from your statement that has been filed, there is a reference on page 2, and I have the name of, and he stopped. And he said, and I had the number, and I'm going to leave that for a second. Then he stopped again and said, I will offer a reward, and he looked at all the other counselors, to anyone who can tell me the number of that statement. And everybody laughed. I really don't understand. I don't understand. Second witness, Paul Leshid, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his last name, he was summoned, which means you have to go even though it could be against your best interest. So he was a regular citizen, and he protested at the Windsor Bridge during the nights between 9 p.m. and 1 a.m., something like that. And then we obviously see that everything is going to be to gather intelligence against the citizens. So he was asked, how did you get involved? How did you hear about rallies and protests? So you can see it's just intelligence gathering, right? So the question, did you post on social media? Did you join groups on social media? So he obviously is saying no, because he was just getting basic information. He's a father of 3, if I'm not mistaken. He has obviously his own company. He's married. He's busy. But he got some information here and there, and he wanted to support the protest because he was feeling, obviously, that he was being not only restricted in his freedom, but most importantly, he was seeing people around him being almost to the point of bankruptcy and sometimes bankruptcy. So he was never told to leave or he would be arrested. So this is the reason why this is important, because obviously we're going to see in a minute, he got some charges. He was with his lawyer, and he was the exact place where he was participating in the protest. In this portion, we can see how he said something really, the way he worded it was disturbing to me. There was an F-250 or F-350, that is a big truck, not recognized as police, from Ottawa, and it was coming back and forth. And he was also stating that there were some actions happening. So I'm wondering, who are these people? Why aren't they identifying as police officers? He also mentioned the media and its role in the false narrative. So he said, the only way to know about what was happening was by witnessing with my own eyes. The media was exaggerating the blockages, the number of trucks, and I didn't witness in 5 days other than a peaceful protest. So the part that the government is unable to understand and even to believe is that people like this gentleman and even myself, we were not interested in politics before this situation started. We would have never been in protests or anything like that. But then when you go and look at reality versus what the media is telling you, now you want to be involved. Now you want to see with your own eyes what is happening. More questions about the communication of the police with the protesters. So he was shown this flyer on which he was supposedly informed of all the effects that were taking place as a result of the state of emergency. He denied having seen it beforehand. And here the questions again continue about this misunderstanding. Did you know anyone beforehand? Do you know how the protest started? Do you think that it came together organically? And obviously that was the case. Here the questioning continues. Were you in touch with this person? What was the connection with Ottawa and Windsor? Bear in mind, this is a father of three who has his own business. He's just going at night trying to support all the people with the lack of freedom, and he's being asked about intelligence. Clearly, the gentleman doesn't have a clue of who was the leader here or there. How do you think the bridge was selected to make the protest? How is that supposed to be answered by this gentleman? How many people were there? How many trucks were there? How did you learn about this? Were you involved in social media? Did you hear? Look at this horrible statement. Why is being asked these things? Of course, he said no. Now, when it was the turn of the Canadian government counselor, I was completely unimpressed. This lady has not been shown before, and she was very aggressive. The tone on which she was addressing this gentleman was really awful. And during this section, some media clips from the US were shown, and the tone, as I said, was very aggressive and inflammatory. So based on some loose clips from the US, he was being asked questions, which makes no sense at all. Now it was the turn for the counselor for the Windsor police, back to the usual repetitive questions. How did you communicate with Mr. King? They are obsessed with this gentleman. They keep on gathering intelligence against the citizens. And if you have ever been in contact with this gentleman or ever dared to watch a single clip from him, you are going to be in deep trouble. For the witness counselor, the objective obviously is to clear the reason why he was there. But in the beginning, it was very aggressive, in my opinion, against him. He was asked when did he start to protest and participate in rallies in 2021. And again, he was saying, I was concerned about the small businesses having a lot of hardship as a result of these mandates. And here he was asked if he attended this protest of another bad person. Of course, everyone who has ever heard of Chris Sky then is a bad person, because since day one he has always predicted, quote predicted, because it's so obvious that this has been written for a very long time. And he predicted all the situations. So if he talked to this gentleman, well, that's really bad. Was it publicized? Was social media used? So once again, they're gathering information. So I don't understand why this lawyer was not doing a better job for him. And here we are seeing the surveillance that was gathered according to him using drones, etc. His accounts were frozen. The funds were released 4 days later. But did you find out why your accounts were frozen? No. Then the witness counselor wanted to show a video, and there was an opposing counselor saying the video had recently been released to them very few hours beforehand or something like that. So I really don't think it should be shown, etc. So this gentleman that I listen from time to time, he's excellent. His website is shown, his YouTube channel is shown below. He does a lot of research that I don't have time to do. So if you want to go deeper into the videos that potentially should have been used in this section but were not shown, you can go and look at his visuals. He is showing here potentially what the video might have been. Of course, he doesn't know. He's just speculating, but he's really good. He shows some German shepherds used against the citizens, and obviously there are a lot of videos online that are very disturbing, and it shows police brutality. And clearly the lead commissioner is not going to allow this, because now we know they really don't want the truth. Some videos from this same channel showing obviously visuals of the Windsor blockade, so you can see the line of the police officers and all the citizens on the back. The third and final witness was a gentleman called Marco van Hugenbos. I'm not even going to try. I don't even know how to pronounce his last name. He is the town councillor for Coutts, and also he was summoned, so he had his personal counselor present to make sure that anything that will be given in evidence will not be used, and also making clear that he was compelled to provide answers. So once again, remember that yesterday we saw that Ford, the premier, that is the person who should be able to provide the biggest scope of information because he was the overseeing entity of the whole Ottawa and Windsor, plus Sarnia and Toronto and many other places where the protests were taking place. Well, he is protected by the parliamentary option on which he doesn't have to be a witness. So it comes to prove that this is not about finding the truth because anyone can be summoned, but not the main person who gathers all the main information. So here you see some visuals of Alberta versus the US in terms of the border that was blocked. And here you can see the very famous Milk River blockage that was almost where there was a big stop here to prevent Quds to have more people at the border. In the direct examination, obviously they're gathering more intelligence, and he talked about the positive interaction he had with the RCMP and his reason for being in this protest. And obviously you can see how he's talking about the fact that first of all, he wanted to support Ottawa for those people who were closer to this location. Obviously, it would be easier for them than to go all the way down to Ottawa. And he said that the worst part was the lies from the government and for the freedom lovers Albertans. So for anyone who has been listening to me for a while, you know that I love the West. There's a love for freedom and for the whole system of the West. They love horses. They produce the food for all of us. They have a lot of resources. They are based on oil and gas. And I love all that industry. So I really love the West. And the way he presented his statements, it just proves that these people feel different than the rest of us. I have lived in Ontario, I have lived in Quebec. I've never lived in the West. Hopefully one day I will do. But you can see here how he's talking about the fact that now you're being governed by the health authority and there is no direct communication through the West parliamentary democracy. So obviously he's involved in politics, so he understands the right and correct routes to communicate with the government, and he was not getting through. And he mentioned specifically the fact that during the stampede of 2021, they said they will never have these. I'm not going to use that word because I may get pulled. And then 1 month later, they said it will be required. And he said we didn't have a voice in Alberta. Continuing with the commission counselor, the usual questions and more. So did you know this gentleman prior to Quds? So remember that this gentleman is in jail right now. Did you know of these with the protesters? I'm not going to use that word because I may get pulled down. Did you know about plans to do this? I'm not going to even read that. Were your accounts frozen? His accounts were not frozen. Have you been arrested? No, but he was charged with mischief, and that's the reason why he had the lawyer with him today, and he stated that he left on February 14. Remember that in February 14 was when the act was invoked. Continuing with his testimony and the direct examination, his words when asked, would you like to add anything else I haven't asked? So once again, beautiful words. If you want to stop the screen and read them, I had the exact words, and here you can see what everybody makes a clear, sarcastic comment. 2 weeks to flatten the curve and see where we are now. For the trust of Albertans, you have to be regained. For the trust of Albertans to be regained, the government has to be held accountable. In this section from the Government of Alberta Councillor, he described how he became organically the spokesperson and also his assessing the size of the protest. So apparently he was asked by the media if he could ask some questions, some other people as well, but the direction for the group was not to talk to the media, and the reason is clear. The media exaggerates and will twist your words or will edit your answers to make you appear in a very negative light. So there's always this perception that you shouldn't talk to the media, so he was also in the beginning saying no, but eventually he was open to one interview, and that's how he became the so-called spokesperson, but he was not the organizer. He was just there to support like everybody else. So he talked about 10,000 people on Saturday, February 6th. Each one had to take care of their own food and accommodation. So once again, it just talks about the lack of central organization. This was, again, individuals coming together to support and protest all these mandates. Concerns about this group that obviously we all know tends to infiltrate any type of peaceful protest, and very sad to hear that both him and his family were receiving threats at the time, and he was not even able to walk on his own to Milk River. Remember, Milk River is on the north side of Coutts, so he was threatened. His family actually had to change residences until the Coutts protest didn't stop. So very sad that these things are happening, and I really wonder who is doing this. I think we all tend to know. The cross-examination continued, and again, they're trying to defend his position and the reason why he was there, that it was purely peaceful. And he was shown a piece of intelligence from the CBSA and openly states what everybody knows. So this is the title of the video. Everybody knows this entity is not popular in Alberta, perhaps so more than in other provinces. So if he's not popular in Ontario and Quebec, I can totally see where his point is. So here the Canadian government councillor was starting the cross-examination, and obviously the objective is to use hand-picked media to magnify and exaggerate. So 2 videos were shown, again from the US stations, which makes no sense to me, and they were using words like this, and obviously using very short versions of what we know is not necessarily the consensus of the of the people who were there. On this portion, they were talking about the infamous guns that they were seized, and I don't know if you remember 2 or 3 days ago when we were talking about Jeremy Mackenzie and his infamous Diagolon, there were some of these vests that were taken and seized at the same time that these guns, and they had 2 lines, and they were attributed to this so-called movement, and that's part of the reason why he is currently in jail. So this picture was shown, and the Q&A indicates also the tendency of the government to exaggerate things. So the question was, this was high-capacity magazines, and his answer was legal high-capacity magazines. And then she responded, but high-capacity magazines. So you can see how, of course, the West and Alberta is very inclined to have guns more so than in the East because of the tradition for hunting and the tradition for freedom. So obviously, this is going to be trying to create a problem. Next question was, did you hear about Arthur's speech? And obviously they're talking about Pastor Pavlovsky. And then he said, no, I walked out when he came in the space where they're talking. And we all know this pastor has been arrested multiple times. In doing research for this video, I found he had been arrested a total of 5 times. That's incredible. And he spent 51 days in jail, and he also had isolation. And I'm going to be honest, I've read a couple of books about isolation in jails, and it is the worst punishment you can have. So to put a person who's simply protesting and he being a pastor in isolation in jail is pretty harsh. So recently, this is an article from June of this year, this was talking about the fact that everything was revoked, and some of the fines actually that he has been forced to pay will be returned to him. But you can see how he is still having issues, and you can see here the 100,000 ticket for feeding the homeless, and he's still in house arrest for criminal charges for nothing. So extremely sad. We also know about this other pastor who was also arrested. And again, it's just pretty scary that pastors who are just trying to help us spiritually in moments like these are being arrested, put in jail when real criminals are being released. In this section, the questions were trying to indicate that the atmosphere of the protest was really very peaceful, and it's because it was again the turn of his own counselor, and again he was talking about the fact that his own family was threatened. My point of view, the way I see it, talking to the protesters was never an option for the government, which is literally the easiest way all these things could have been managed. Why didn't the federal government choose to talk to the protesters? It's a mystery to me, because looking at it now, seeing so much division between the different locations of the protests, I feel that even it may have worked in the government favor. Because if you look at it in retrospective, and of course the federal government had more information than us at the time, they could have said, sure, bring me your leader. And then they couldn't even agree on the leader. So that would have been a very easy way to dismantle the whole thing. But that was never an option. They wanted to crush the movement of freedom. The protests didn't have any political intent. It was just a logical demand for bodily autonomy on behalf of many Canadians, and I thank the truckers. The Emergency Act was not supported by any of the 4 requirements to be invoked. The Emergency Act was never validated by the Senate prior to be used, so from inception it was misused. Never mind freezing the assets, the money, and arresting people simply for speaking. And the media is a government propaganda vehicle. We can see how consistently they deceive and exaggerate and build stories based on pieces of speeches or videos or things that you say. In summary, you are requested, and not only requested, but actually obliterated, not to think or question the government, or you will be punished. The government created this magical virus fairy tale to obliterate our free will and divide us, and people are not attentive or intuitively awake to see through these lies. These are the words of the Prime Minister of this country, which clearly clarifies where he stands and how everything that we see is designated to create a negative reaction from us and divide us, so we can be easily manipulated. As usual, I'll leave that for you to read. You can stop the screen. Thank you very much for listening.